Appreciate you joining us. And today we're going to cover lateral, laterals and trees, and then green surface as well. So we're going to get through all these here. So laterals are things that we talked about when we talked about the definitions. They're basically three different things that fall under the lateral category. Can be penalty areas, extreme rough, or out of bounds. And so we'll see all three of these throughout the course of the year. And there are a lot of things that can be called quote unquote penalty areas that you might not necessarily think would be penalty areas, but basically any area that the course is deciding to play where players will get a drop there with the one-stroke penalty. With the exception being out of bounds, even if the course said that they would get a one penalty drop from out of bounds, it's against the rules of golf, so we can't use that. But really, we're talking about these three things, and the penalty areas and extreme rough can sometimes get confused sometimes, but it really just comes down to how they're played when it comes to the rules of golf. So if you might have an area that is fescue or forest, and the course now under the rules of golf has flexibility in terms of defining those areas as penalty areas or just lost ball areas, and we need to figure out which ones they are so we can rate it properly, because there are some different adjustments that would come into play if it is going to be treated as a lost ball penalty. So that'll be something that the captain will gather from the course prior to us rating, or if there's any questions about specific areas, they'll ask during the rate or after the rate to get clarification. Another good place to kind of see these types of things is always a good idea to look at the scorecard. A lot of times on the back of the scorecards, the course will list out something like all native areas are to be played as lateral or something like that. Because not every course is going to put red stakes up and down every hole, or if there's a tree line course in northern Michigan, they might not do that. And now the rules of golf allow them to use natural boundaries to define those areas, as opposed to having to have stakes like it was before. So if you do have any questions about if something is a penalty area or lost ball, make sure that you talk with the captain. The captain should explain that before you go out, because you are going to want to know what the differences are. Okay, and when we are evaluating this, we're evaluating it down the entire length of the hole. So there's going to be, in some cases, there's going to be multiple instances that we're looking at. We're looking at it in landing zone 1, landing zone 2, and then when we get to the green, on a par 5, for example, 3-shot hole par 5, you might have a bogey player that takes more than 2 shots to get to a par 4, and you'll look at 3 different values there. And basically what we do to determine when those things come into play is that we take the largest value that we get off the chart, and then there is a adjustment if we do have a couple large values that we encounter on one hole. So how are we evaluating this? We're looking at the shot length to get to where we're going, to the landing zone. So obviously, if I'm hitting a tee shot, I have a wider distribution of my shots. So it's going to be, a higher value there as opposed to if I had a 100-yard shot to the green. So we need to know how far we're hitting the shot. We need to know the distance from the center of the landing zone. So that could be from the middle of the fairway, or it could be from the middle of the green, but we're going to measure that to get our distance when we go to our chart. And then we're also looking at the size, the conditions in the lateral obstacle, conditions in the area adjacent to the lateral obstacle. So you might have out of bounds, but you might have a big fence that's going to prevent the ball from going out of bounds in some cases, or you might have a tree that's blocking balls from going into a certain area. Those are things that we'll look at. And then we also look at the number of times we have the obstacle come into play on the course of the hole. All right. We also look at conditions that can decrease or increase the likelihood of the lateral obstacles closely bordering the green coming into play. So maybe you have a cart path that helps bounce the ball into these laterals. That's an adjustment that we'll talk about that comes up quite a bit, honestly. And then bounce can be both negative and minus, or sorry, negative and plus. We talked about, the minus one being if there's a big fence there, well, then the ball's not gonna go out of bounds or go into the area as much because we have the fence there. But if there's no fence and it's just cart path and out of bounds, then the ball is gonna be likely to get in that area more because of that cart path. And there's also some adjustments when the green is surrounded by a lateral obstacle. And then we also will talk about this P adjustment that we talked about in crossing that will allow us to essentially look at certain things that may prevent the obstacle from coming into play as much as we think, and also to make recovery from where we're at more likely in certain cases. So here's just an example of a hole that we have here in Michigan, Eagle Eye number 17. It's a replica of Sawgrass, which you'll see on TV this weekend if you watch the Players Championship. But this is obviously that we have a crossing with the tee shot, but we also have a lateral issue at the green because left and right of the green here and over the green is penalty area that we need to worry about. And then we're also, when we're going down the hole, we're also looking at this isn't a great example, but let me take you to one that is. We're looking at distances to the lateral left and right. And then here's a good example. We're going down the right side here, we have the water on the left, but then we also have this tall heather grass here on the right that we're worrying about. So we're worrying about both. And when we do measure, we're going to go to, or our measuring point is going to be from the middle of the fairway. We don't necessarily need to go into the middle of the fairway and shoot our rangefinder to one side. Typically what you'll do is you'll just, from whatever edge you're shooting the fairway with, you'll shoot to the lateral. And then let's say that distance is 20 here, and then your fairway width is 40. So half of your fairway is 20. So from the middle of the fairway to the lateral on the right would be the 20 of the middle, and then the 20 to the right. So a distance of 40. If you didn't get that, it's pretty straightforward and you'll pick it up. You can also go to the middle and shoot out if you want. It'll just take a little bit longer, but that's definitely an option that you can do if you'd like. All right. So we talked about this before, but again, it's important to know if an area is treated as a penalty area or a stroke and distance penalty will apply. So if we do have a stroke and distance penalty being applied, or a lost ball, I probably should use the correct term, stroke and distance. If there's a stroke and distance penalty, then there's going to be a K adjustment applied in many situations. We'll talk about one situation where we actually won't apply the K even if there is an out of bounds or stroke and distance adjustment. But the most common scenario when we deal with an out of bounds or a stroke and distance is we have a K adjustment. So again, it's important to know how the course plays it. And we will talk with the course to make sure we find out exactly how they play it. All right, and then we talked about this last week when we do have a crossing obstacle that exists, but the crossing obstacle rating value is 0. And there's no lateral obstacle on that hole, then we're going to record a value of 1 under lateral for that. So basically, again, we talked about this last week. The rationale behind this is that when we're looking at these scenarios, every obstacle has a different weighting value. When the sausage is made and the course rating, the slope rating gets spit out, and the lateral obstacle carries a little higher weighting value. So basically what they're saying is that we're going to apply it here so that there is so it counts, but it's going to count a little bit more than it would just simply under crossing. So it doesn't make much sense to me, to be honest, but that's the way that the USGA and the RNA have it. So that's the way we do it. And if you have this situation come up, it will probably be maybe once every 3 or 4 rates if you're lucky, because typically you'll have a lateral obstacle on most holes. But sometimes they're over 50 yards, so they don't exist. If it's more than 50 yards from the line of play, you could run into a couple of those situations. Some you might not have it at all. It could be just a hole that's bordered by a couple other holes that doesn't have any penalty areas or anything left or right. But if that situation comes up, that's how you handle it. Even though it's technically a crossing value, the 1 would go under the lateral. All right, so before we get into these adjustments, I just wanted to just show you really quick on a sample form 1. Zoom in here. So most times on the form 1, you'll have the lateral option here. It'll be displayed for you. This is something that our measuring team gathers and will be available to you. However, the only one that we put on the sheet is the one at the green. So all the other ones throughout the hole, you're getting measuring with your rangefinder when you're out there. Okay, and then typically you'll see that there's just one value listed here. It does apply to both. One of the things we are working on, for those of you that are experienced, we're working on finding a way to display this better so that it's known that it applies to both, because one of the common things we hear from new folks is that they think it applies just to the scratch player because it's only in the scratch player's box. So that's something we're working on. The form 1 may look a tad bit different come May, April when we're starting to rate. But for now, this is where that lateral at the green will be displayed, and all the other ones you'll get when you go and rate the hole. So again, we're going to go down, we're going to get to our landing zone. We're going to look left and right to make sure that there's anything that we need to measure, whether it's penalty area, out of bounds, or extreme rough. And again, our measurement value that we're putting on the form 1 is going to be from the middle of the fairway. So some adjustments that, I guess before we get to the adjustments, let's just take a look at the chart really quick. So there's a male and a female chart here. And then we also have a common thing where we have the scratch value on the left and the bogey value on the right. So again, these are the shot lengths. So we need to know how far the shot was to get to where we're going. Okay, so very, very straightforward on the approach shot because that number is given to us. One thing that trips up some people is when we're going from one fairway landing zone to the second one on a par 5 3-shot hole, or on a 3-shot hole, I should say. We have to keep in mind that that next shot that we're hitting is that 220 for scratch male, 170 for bogey male, 190 for the scratch female, and 130 for the bogey female. So keep that in mind if you have 3 landing zones on a hole, that second one, that shot length that you're using to get the value is that full length shot that you hit on a second or subsequent shot for your golfer. All right. And then the last thing on the chart here is we see that when we're looking here, we need to find the distance, and we need to know the distance from the middle of the landing zone. So that's how we get to our certain charts. So if we have a value of, let's just say, for example, let's go to really quickly, we can just go to a par 3, 170. We have a lateral value of 45. So this is male. We won't worry about any adjustments. So 45 scratch is 170. And a 45 is a 0 here, or sorry, is a 1. So that's going to be a 1 on our form 1 here. And then for the bogey, we have, again, the 170 shot, a lateral of 45 again. So 170 falls in here, and then 45 is going to get us to a value of 2. So that's just a simple look up there without any adjustments or anything like that. All right, so let's go through some of these adjustments here. So first one is B, or the bounce adjustment. So again, we have both a plus and a minus here. When we have a plus, again, it's making the hole harder or more challenging. So it's going to increase the likelihood that the ball will bounce into the obstacle. There is a note in there that says, do not use the distance from the center of the target landing zone is less than 15 yards. So if you had that situation like that, you would not apply a B plus adjustment. Maybe that'll happen once a year. Doesn't happen a ton, but you will see B plus a lot. Cart pass that run down the hole might be near the green and near a penalty area there, or out of bounds. You might have, it could be a sloping ground. So a downslope that kind of kicks the ball and ricochets the ball towards the obstacle. That would be another scenario that you want to think about. And then the other thing too, when you're thinking about this, is also to think about, the shot that your golfer is hitting, right? Because this is a shot specific adjustment. So you might, if you're hitting a longer shot into the green, there's a greater likelihood that your ball is going to miss the green. And if that's the case, you might be more inclined to apply a B adjustment in that case versus a shot that could be 35 yards from the middle of the green. Well, chances are you're not going to miss the green. So the likelihood of it coming into play is pretty minimal. And then the minus adjustment is if it decreases the likelihood the ball will bounce or fly into the obstacle. So probably the most common one that we see is an out of bounds fence. Definitely see a lot of those. We also see at a lot of courses we'll have trees that are being near the out of bounds or near laterals that will block the ball from going there. So that would be another scenario where you might be able to put in a B minus. And then the next obstacle here we talked about is the K, or stroke and distance. And again, that's if we have a ball that's going to be going into an area that does have a stroke and distance penalty applied. So sometimes you'll see on your Form 1, there actually will be on this Form 1, you'll have like a L32K, signifying that the measuring team or the captain has determined that area is or definitely has a stroke and distance penalty. If it's not listed there, then you'll just need to make sure that you know that an area is stroke and distance or not. And again, for out of bounds, it's always stroke and distance. White stakes, 100% always stroke and distance. Other areas just be depending on how the course plays them. All right, the next adjustment here is our P percentage adjustment. So if here is basically if an obstacle, I'm just going to read it because it's easier just to read this thing because it does come up a lot. If the obstacle is narrow or only borders part of the landing zone, or can be played from some of the time, and or a significant barrier, tall net, steep slope, minimizes the chance that a shot would reach the lateral obstacle, consider using an appropriate percentage of the table value plus above adjustments to determine the rating value. Generally, this adjustment is in increments of 25%. So basically what we're looking at here is we're looking at it in terms of how easy it is to recover from certain areas, but then also how likely the scenario is to come up to get there in the first place. So if we think about this from looking at this hole here, I mean, if we hit the ball in the water on the left, like there's zero chance of us playing it, right? It's going to be at the bottom of the pond here or the lake, and there's no chance that we're going to be able to recover. However, on the right here in this heather area, you know, sometimes depending on how thick the heather is, we may be able to find it and to play out of there and advance the ball. So that would be a scenario where if it was, you know, not super dense, thick, rough, or sorry, rough, but extreme rough or heather, then we would have a P- adjustment there. And then based on how much you can recover from it would be if you do a, you know, 25%, 50%, 75%. Most cases, if you have substantial heather, you're not going to do anything more than, you know, 25%. But there could be places where the golf course, you know, doesn't have thick heather, or they purposely the heather is more is not as thick. And in those areas, you might go more, or you might have a penalty area that is marked with a red stake and red line, but is very much dry and is always dry, and you can play from it. You know, a good example of that is a lot of times, or sometimes you might have where the course starts to mark an area, and then you have another 5 or 10 yards before it gets to the water. Well, if in that 5 or 10 yards, you know, you can play from it pretty easily and hit a good recovery shot, then that might, you know, be something that you would P-, because technically to get to where you can't recover from, it's a farther distance, and that might put you into another category on our chart here. So we should P- in that case. So there's a couple. Yeah, good point, Lori, on that. When you do have the adjustments that come into play, it is important to put them next to the landing zone, and not at the bottom. So what Lori's talking about in that case here is that if we just use the first hole as an example, I might get to my landing zone and I might measure the distance to the lateral as 30 here. But if I had a K adjustment, I would throw it right on the 30 here. So I know that applies to that, because it's not, most of these are, maybe, I think all of these might be, I don't know, there's a couple that aren't. Most of these are shot specific. So when we need to make sure we're attaching it to the right one, because even if we have a K, it doesn't apply to everything. It only applies to where the K is, or what landing zone has the K. And likewise, if you have a P-, you know, you might have a K and then a P-. You would, geez, that's terrible, minus, but you would be able to write it there as well, right next to it. And then you might go down farther the hole and you might have, you know, 28. And in this case here, you don't have any adjustment. Good point there, Lori. Yeah, good question, Dennis, on the extreme rough and waste areas. If we do, so waste areas are essentially can be kind of treated as both bunkers and extreme rough. It just, you know, depending on you know, how they're used. Yeah, I don't, unfortunately, I don't have a ton of examples or experience with how, you know, you would distinguish the two. Basically, I mean, if it's, I guess, you know, some waste areas are designed to be more, I guess you'd say, like lateral to the hole, and not necessarily bunkers around the greens, or you might have like a waste area that you'd see at Pinehurst number 2, that's more like native area, whereas you might have like an actual like waste area that is kind of all sand and prepared like that. So every situation is a little different. But when you do look at waste areas and you're looking at from like a lateral perspective, I guess, those you definitely would have some P minus to it if you had them, because obviously in a waste area, like the ability to recover from those is pretty high. So if we are evaluating it from a lateral perspective, that's going to be a low value for sure. Yeah, good. So a good question here. So is the lateral measured from where the course stakes it, or from where the unplayable area starts? So in the picture here, so basically what we're measuring from is we're measuring from where it is staked, or where the line is. In most cases, when we're out there, the golf course is not going to have things staked or lined, and so it's going to de facto be that kind of natural boundary here, where the water starts and the grass stops. But if the course does have stakes, that we technically would use those areas. In the grand scheme of things, in most cases, we're talking about 1 or 2 yards. It's really not going to make that big of a difference one way or the other. Yeah, there's the off scenario that it could put us into a different category or a different column. But usually we're talking about 1 or 2 yards, whether it's using the edge of the water or where the course has it staked. But technically it's where the penalty area starts. Yeah, John, good point on the waste areas. We don't run into a ton of them. I can only think of a couple of courses off the top of my head where we have them. But there's probably more than I'm thinking of. But I know I've probably deal with like 1 a year when I do my number of rates every year. So yeah, if it does come up, we will kind of explain to you how we're going to treat that, and what section it's going to fall under in terms of how we're rating it. But the important thing here too, and we'll get to this with lateral in a second, is that when we do have certain things that can kind of count as both, we want to make sure that we're not overrating both sides. So there's going to be a little comment in here about underbrush under trees when we get to trees, and how if it's extreme rough, it should be categorized as that, and the tree value should be low. So basically what the book is saying here is that we don't want too high values. And likewise with the waste areas, we don't want to count it doubly hard twice, where if we're going to count it in different areas, we're going to lessen one and elevate the other. All right, I want to get through a couple of these, a couple more of these adjustments, and we'll do a quick example, and then we'll move on to trees here. So the next adjustment here is squeeze. So squeeze can be if the distance between lateral obstacles that border both sides of the fairway. Key point there: both sides of the fairway is less than 40 yards for a +1, or a +2 for less than 30 yards. So this could happen if you have lateral on both. You can keep in mind it doesn't need to be water on both. It could be water on one and out of bounds on the other, but the distance between them needs to be 40 yards or less. So you'll find that in a lot of cases that it's oftentimes over 40 yards. So this adjustment doesn't apply a ton, but to keep in mind when you do have some low values left and right, to make sure that you're looking both directions there. And then the S adjustment is a surround adjustment, and that's if we have our eagle eye number 17 example, where a portion of the green is surrounded by the lateral, and there's a chart here that we use for that. If it's a quarter to a half, then there's certain adjustments. It needs to be less than 5 yards to the edge. If it's more than half, then it can be 5 to 10 yards from the edge of the penalty area, or edge of the green to the penalty area, or out of bounds or extreme rough. And then there are different adjustments based on how close it is, but just keep in mind that that's something that when we meet at the green, this will be something that our team talks about, and if there is adjustment, we will definitely talk about it and make sure everyone is aware of it when we meet at the green. Doesn't happen a ton, but you know, it can happen. The key thing here is that it just needs to hit these certain fraction of green surround requirements in order for it to apply. And then the last adjustment here is this 2 adjustment. And this is where if we have the lateral obstacle, or if a lateral obstacle comes into play on 2 or more shots, each must have a rating of 5 or higher. And that includes the adjustment. So even if your value is a 4, if you have an adjustment that gets it up to a 5, then that would count. And then if you have 2 or more of those values, then you're going to use the highest one. And then if they total 11 or less, you'll add a +1. And if they total 12 or more, you'll add a +2. So if I have an obstacle off the tee, let's just say I'm a female bogey player, and I'm hitting my tee shot here. So 130, or sorry, 150, and the value that I measure is 20 yards. So that gets me to a 5 here. And then my next shot, I hit it my 130, and I measure a value of 17, which gets me in the second column here. Second shot goes 130, that gets me a 5. Then if those are my 2 numbers, then I'd have a 5 and a 5, and then that would equate to getting a +1 adjustment, so that my value, what I would write down on the piece of paper, would be 6. All right, so let's take this to the Form 1 here. So we just went through that example, and basically what you want to do is, and a lot of times this is can be somewhat challenging, but because if you do have multiple ones, you need to look at each individual value to figure out which one gets used. Because remember at the beginning, we said that if we have multiple values or landing zones that we're looking at, we're going to take the highest one total. The highest one, and use it for our value. So we're going to write down every single one we have, and then for some people, what they do is they'll write the actual value in parentheses, like here or wherever. So that they'll say, okay, this is 30K P minus is going to be whatever it is, and they'll write it down here, and then 28 is going to be a value here, and then they'll know, okay, I take the higher one, and then if I take the higher one, then I'll put the higher one down here. So let's just do this example right here, and we'll get our final value. So our first one here, we have 30 yards for our lateral. We've got a K plus and a P minus. So I should probably see if I can make that look like a P minus. Okay. And then here we're just going to do 28, and then we won't worry about any adjustments for the green as well. So we'll have 3 values that we're going to figure out, and then we'll figure out what our total value is. So 30 for our tee shot. So when we look at our tee shot for male golfer, scratch player, the tee shot goes 250. So anytime there's a tee shot, it's the bottom row unless we're laying up for whatever reason. So 250 to a 30, value of 30 is a 3. And then our K plus gets it up to a 4, but then the P minus knocks it down back to a 3. So our value is going to be a 3 here. So let's just go ahead and write that down. .28 is our next one. That's our second shot. So our second shot for scratch player is 220. So we go to our 220 value. We go to the value of 28, and that gets us a value of 4. And then our last one is 32. So when it's at the green, we need to know our approach shot. So our approach shot's up here, 83 yards. When you get used to doing this, you won't even waste your time looking it up, because you know 83 yards is not going to create a high value, but 83 yards at, what was it, 30, 32? 32 is going to be a 1. So this is a 1. So we look at all 3 values and we take the highest one, which is going to be a 4. So that's going to be our measurement, or our final value there. So I think for those of you that are new to this, I personally, I think this is the hardest value to look up and get right. It requires the most effort because you're looking at multiple values on most holes, except for, you know, par threes. But I think this is the one that's challenging to understand. So if you don't quite get it right away, don't worry, because this is something that gets confused very easily. But and we look at every single one, and we're going to take our highest value and write that down. Yep, Lori made a good comment about surrounds. It used to be just so under previous books, when the rules of golf had water hazards and not penalty areas, it was just water that we were looking at, or water hazards. And now with surrounds, we're looking at penalty areas, out of bounds, and extreme rough. So can definitely come up more than it has in the past. But again, we're still looking at those 3 things when we're talking about surrounds: penalty area, out of bounds, and extreme rough. All right, any questions on laterals before we move on to trees? Okay. All right, so let's go on to trees here. All right, so a couple of things with trees. Trees are a little unique in that we are looking at the difficulty factor for trees. I'm just going to read it here. By considering the following for each shot that is to be played on the hole based on the scratch player's ability to recover from the tees. So even though we're looking at it from the scratch and the bogey player's perspective, and we're going to fill out both left and right on the Form 1, when we're evaluating the difficulty factor for recovering or from trees, we're looking at from the scratch player's ability. Okay, so we'll show you here something really quick, but I just want to just read through this again. So we're looking at the overall impact of trees in the play of the hole, and once the entire hole has been evaluated for trees, a rating value is assigned. And we'll see there's, just like we had for topography, we're going to have this kind of minor problem, moderate problem, significant problem, or extreme problem thing that we're looking at. And then it says here generally that the impact of trees in the tee shot landing zone will be the most important factor in determining the trees for rating the hole. So kind of how this process works is trees are something that we continue to evaluate as we go down the hole. But when we get to the green, this is one of the things that we always talk about and debate and argue about at the green. And it's always it's a good place to do it, because you can look back and see the hole and see how the trees impact play, but really best from that angle. But again, it's important to understand that we're looking at it just on the scratch player's ability to recover, excuse me, from trees. So there is an explanation from that in the course rating manual that, again, unfortunately we can't share with everyone, but did want to share it here. So it asks the question: the bogey player is not as skilled as a scratch player in recovering from trees, yet we rate recovery for the bogey player based on the scratch player's ability to recover from trees. Is this a fair way to rate trees for the bogey player? There's both a practical reason and a technical reason why recovery from both golfers is based on the scratch player's ability. From a practical standpoint, it is difficult to consistently predict a bogey player's ability to play the wide variety of recovery shots that trees can present. It is easier to visualize how a scratch player is able to recover from trees, which enables rating teams to be more consistent in the rating process. And then from a technical standpoint, the final rating value for trees are subject to a weighting factor, for both tree obstacles and the overall obstacle stroke value. The weighting factor for trees and the overall weighting of obstacles is much higher for the bogey player, which ensures that the impact of the trees rating is higher for the bogey player, even if the rating value for trees is the same as the scratch player. And then this process is designed to provide consistent, accurate, and fair ratings for both golfers. So I just bring that up and saying that it's really important that we think about this, or not. When we're looking at trees only, we're looking at just the scratch player's ability. So it's just important to keep in mind. So I would encourage you to lean on the better players that or the better golfers that you're rating with, to get their thoughts on tree recoverability. It's also important to keep in mind that what a scratch player is. So if we go to the definitions and we look at the actual definition of a scratch player, it says that it's a player with a 0.0 handicap index. Okay, so someone that has a 0.0 handicap index is not Tiger Woods, is not someone on the PGA Tour. So keep that in mind too. You're not thinking about that. Really, what you're thinking about is 0.0 golfer nowadays is probably in most cases like the number one player on an average high school team, and probably a mid-level junior golfer. So that's kind of what you're thinking about for a scratch player, just in terms of trying to evaluate it. But again, it's someone that's a 0.0, so it's not someone that's shooting under par all the time. It's not someone that's shooting they're not necessarily what we would define as a quote unquote scratch or really, really good player. Those are going to be plus golfers that we're not really looking at either. All right, so some of the things that we look at when we're looking at the difficulty factor for trees, we're looking at the number of trees, the height of them, and the density, of course, at mid-season conditions. And then we're also looking at the distances from the center of the landing zone. So obviously, if trees are farther away from our landing zones, they're going to come into play less often. And so that is a factor. We're looking at the length of the shot required to reach the next landing zone or the green. If you have a shorter shot, it's typically easier to recover because more types of shots can be played. And a ball in trees may require the player hit an extra shot to reach the green, which can make it more difficult. And there's a couple examples that we'll talk about when that comes up. Low-hanging branches could impact recovery conditions under the tree that affect the lie of ball. So if you have kind of uneven or nasty surfaces as opposed to normal rough or things like that could be a factor we look at. The proximity of trees to the ball when in flight, that could result in significant loss of distance. Then we're also looking at conditions along the line of play that limit your options. So if you have a creek that runs across the middle of the fairway, your recovery might be limited in that sense, because you might not be able to play a low runner out of the trees because it will just run right into the creek. So those are all things that you look at when we're evaluating this. There's a few examples here. So we'll go through a couple common problems that a course rater must consider when determining the impact on scoring and overall tree rating for a hole. So a long par 4 has trees that tightly line the fairway. A tee shot that is hit offline by 15 yards right or left and strikes an overhanging branch may end up well short of the normal landing zone, which already requires a long approach shot. Any reduction in distance could require an extra shot to reach the green. So in this case here, it's going to may require an extra shot. So the difficulty value of that is going to be much higher. From the tee on a dogleg hole, hitting the fairway on one side of the dogleg may result in trees partially obstructing the next shot from that side of the fairway. However, it is a par 5, and these trees would not likely prevent a player from still reaching the green in 3 shots. However, if this was a 2-shot hole, the recovery problems will be more significant, since a player may not reach the green from the trees. So again, this is an example here where we have to keep in mind that if it's a par 5, sometimes the trees are going to be seen as less significant, because even though we might not be able to hit it as far as we normally would if we were in the trees, or if the ball was deflected by the trees, we would still have an extra shot an extra shot to get to the green. In that case, it may not actually end up costing us an extra stroke. And then most of the trees on a hole are within extreme rough, and they are not near a landing zone. However, there's a large tree in the middle of the fairway that affects the landing zones from a number of tees. The tree cannot be played over, but can be played around on both sides. Recovery from the area around the tree is minor. However, the tree may obstruct shots at the landing zone or green, depending on the player and the tee being evaluated. Okay, so again, in the past, and I'm not sure, this was way before I started, but we used to do trees strictly based on distance, but they switched to this kind of more subjective way of evaluating trees: minor problem, moderate problem, significant and extreme problem, to allow for these various situations that come up. So before we go over a couple other things too, I think it's just important to look, like if you go to your chart and you can see just kind of how this is laid out. We're talking about all these things: minor problem, moderate problem, significant problem, extreme problem. That's kind of how the chart's laid out. We're going to have a different starting value for a 1-shot hole versus a 2 or more shot hole. And then we'll talk about how these values can be adjusted plus or minus 1 point, or the use of a tweener, which we talked about when we talked about the definitions. So these are kind of the 4 categories that we're putting tree difficulty in. And then obviously we have 1-shot hole or 2 or more shot hole. Yeah, so there's a good question about, I've seen a couple courses in which pines have been trimmed and the lower branches eliminated, making the exit easier. So that would be something that you would look at and definitely have a lower value for that than you would if they didn't make those changes. So yeah, so that's a great example, and you'll see that a lot of places will try and do minor things to make playability a little better at their course, and that's one of those. So we're looking at, that could be an example where you might have a tree, but since you can get out of there and recover fairly easy, then you might have a minor problem versus a moderate problem in that example. John, looks like you raised your hand. Do you have something you'd like to add? You can unmute yourself, or maybe you just raise your hand by mistake.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I want people to keep in mind it's easier than typing it all out. remember where your landing zone is, impact, and where it rolls out to. Because there may be some low-hanging trees on either side, you may impact before those trees are there. And you will roll basically in the fairway to the middle of those trees. Your next shot may not be impeded by an obstruction just because the trees are there. You have to look at where that rollout is and then where your next shot is going. Do the trees impact the shot itself? This is the thing that I run into most. People just, they don't realize the impact of the rollout. So you can elaborate that on if you want to.
Yeah, no, John, that's a great point on the trees. I mean, there could be trees that, I mean, you could have a tree that is, literally in the middle of a hole. And for a certain landing zone, it might not really impact that much at all, maybe just a little bit. Whereas others, if they're coming down near that tree, they're going to have a lot more issues with it. So yeah, it's important to know when your ball or when your golfer's shot is going to hit the ground and what it rolls out to, and thinking about looking at it from that landing zone. And when we get to the shoot here, there's actually like a point that kind of talks a little bit about that as well. So good point there, John. A couple other things. So here's just another example. A tee shot landing area is bordered by trees that are 25 yards from the center of the fairway. On a two-shot hole, it is judged that the scratch player could rarely get out or near the green from the trees, and the rater determines the trees to be a significant problem. Based on the tee shot, the rater assigns a rating value of 6 for trees, and consider a second scenario where the same trees border a 3-shot hole. The scratch player can advance the ball less than half the distance to his normal second landing zone, but is still able to reach the green with his third shot by hitting the longer club, should the recovery problems be significant as well. And it says in determining recovery from the trees, the rater should consider the impact of the player's ability to play of the hole. In the first situation, an extra shot was required for the player to reach the green. In the second scenario, however, the player was still able to reach the green with the third shot, even though it was substantially longer. Because the player did not necessarily lose a shot in recovering from the trees, the rater would be justified in this case in determining the trees to be a moderate rather than a significant problem, resulting in a rating value of 4 or even 5, as the values can be adjusted plus or minus 1 point. So again, just another example of par 4 versus par 5 and keeping that in mind. Underbrush for trees, I'm gonna go through this as I think it's important. So thick underbrush is treated as extreme rough when the underbrush makes it likely the ball will be lost, unplayable, or advanced with great difficulty. How is the recovery from trees affected by underbrush? So underbrush forces the scratch player to hit different recovery shots. Thus, the underbrush may be considered when evaluating the probability of recovering for trees. For example, consider trees with no underbrush located 25 yards from the center of the tee shot landing zone. Assume recovery is a minor to moderate problem based on the scratch player's opportunity to hit a low fade or hook on a rolling shot to recover. The rating for this example would normally be a 3. By adding underbrush to this example, the player's recovery problems will most likely increase. If tree limbs are high and the shot necessary to get out of the underbrush also gets out of the trees, the recovery problems might increase only slightly, say to a moderate problem, which would yield a value of 4. And then if tree limbs are low and thick with foliage, the recovery problems might increase to a 6. It would not be an accurate evaluation of the impact on the player's scoring ability to evaluate the trees without considering the underbrush. So if the underbrush likely leads to a lost ball, this area has to be treated as extreme rough, and the trees should be discarded or severely downgraded. So high ratings in both categories would overstate the impact on scoring for both the scratch and bogey players. So basically what that last part is saying is that we are going to make some evaluations and judgments out there when we think that an area that includes trees is to be played as lateral, or that's how the course plays it, then we're going to treat it like that, and we're going to put a very, very low tree value or not even count it as trees because it's technically part of the lateral or extreme rough. So that will come up quite a bit. So there could be questions where you're not sure if we are going to count this as quote unquote trees or it's going to be counted under lateral. And so if you do have questions about that, get with your captain. But the important thing is we don't want to overrate both here. We want to lower one and elevate the other. D, you wanted to say something?
Kyle, on that hole where the trees are basically making their second or third shot longer than normal.
Mm-hmm.
The third shot, do you go back and change green target because of the length of the shot to the green?
Yeah, no, you would not make any adjustments on the form one. I think that's just a kind of a general statement in that if you have trees in your landing zone on a par five or a 3-shot hole, that there could be scenarios where they're not as significant because you're still going to be able to reach the green in regulation.
I understand that, but if your third shot was normally, we'll say 50 yards to the green, and the trees resulted in you having to hit 100-yard shot to the green, you don't change the green target.
No, because we're assuming that the golfer hits it dead straight every time and it's not in the trees. It's just when we're evaluating like overall tree difficulty, we have to think about, scenarios where that doesn't happen, but it doesn't impact the actual approach shot length, because when we're calculating that, we're just assuming the player hits it straight right down the middle every time.
Okay.
Good question, Marv. John, Olive? Oh, maybe your hand is still lowered or still raised from last time. I think we're good here. So
Needs to be erased.
yeah, all right. I think there's a way for me to lower it somehow, but all right. All right, trees here. So much for getting the green service today, but we'll cover that next time. But trees. So last thing with trees. So there are a couple other places where trees can be impacted. A couple other obstacles we talked about in fairway. A W adjustment could be placed if the tree's overhanging or otherwise reducing the effective width of the fairway. We could put a W adjustment there. And then you could also have an O adjustment under green target if a tree or overhanging branches block the shot to the green. And there's under a green target, there's under the O adjustment there, you'll see kind of how that it's basically overhanging or in front of the green is when that would apply. If we do have if there are no trees on the hole or there's no trees within 50 yards of the line of play, then we're going to have a value of 0. And that could definitely happen on certain courses. Not common, but definitely could happen. And then if a tree does exist, we have to give it a value of 1. So even if there's one tree out there and it may not come into play a ton, we'd still give it a value of 1. Then there's also a shoot adjustment. We're looking at when we have a shoot, the width between the extending branches at the narrowest portion. And then we're also looking at how far it is to clear or pass the point where the shoot exists. So the best way to kind of think about this is to see if I can enlarge this picture a little bit, is to look at this picture here. We have here, and important to note on the shoot as well, is that the shoot for trees applies only to the tee shot. So on any other subsequent shot, it's only going to apply, or you're only going to be able to use an O adjustment. So under the shoot here, this is what we have. This is an example from the manual where it talks about a shoot, and there are a couple things. So I'll read to the second bullet point here. So for example, in the image to the right, the trees overhanging the right side of the fairway at 100 yards from the teen area. So this ends at 100 here. And then on the left, it ends 120 yards away. So when we're measuring our distance, we're measuring from where the chute ends, because it would be appropriate to use 100 yards as the length of the shot required to clear the chute, because the ball is no longer within the chute after 100 yards. Okay, and then last thing here, if the trees are staggered but never directly across on opposite sides, this would not qualify as a chute. However, it may result in an increased table value or possibly the obstruct adjustment. So that's another thing, that the trees need to be on opposite sides. If they're not directly across from each other, then that's not by definition a chute. Let's see here. So a couple other things. Again, we're measuring it based on where the distance from our shot, the tee to where we need to clear the chute. Okay, and then we're looking at it basically at what we use, or what we say is the drip line of the trees, or where the trees come into play. So in here, just to use this example, we'd be looking at, this here and this here to evaluate our distance, because we're looking at the distance from here to here, but also from drip line to drip line. So those are the measurements we use, and then we go to our table to look at those. Let me see here. I just read a couple more things in here, and then we'll go back to look at the tables. Chute tables assume that the ball does not pass through the opening in the chute, and it will hit the tree and be deflected. If the ball may be hit over or under the chute, it would be appropriate to lower the chute table value by 1 or 2 points. Additionally, if the trees that make up the chute are sparse and some shots may be successfully hit through the trees, a reduction in the table values would be in order. Last thing here, let's see. This is kind of what John was talking about a little earlier. The length used to determine the adjustment value for a chute cannot exceed the carry distance for the player. So for example, a bogey woman player cannot have chute length of more than 130 yards, as the ball is on the ground by that point and is not affected by the extending tree branches. Okay, and then also here it says the same trees or tree cannot be used to apply both a chute adjustment and an obstruct adjustment. If the trees qualify for a chute, do not apply an obstruct adjustment for the same trees. It is possible, though, for both the chute and obstruct adjustments to apply on the same hole, but only when one set of trees makes up the chute and a different tree or set of trees earns the obstruct adjustment. All right, so clear this. So when we have the our table values here, again, we're categorizing minor problem, significant or extreme. And then you'll see here when we get to our 2 shot holes, we have a 2, a 4, a 6, and an 8. And this is where we have a good tweener situation where it might be somewhere between a minor and a moderate problem, and that would give us, or would allow us to use a value of 3. Or might be between moderate and significant, and that would allow us to get a value of 5. Okay, and when we do have adjustments here with the chute adjustment, we're going to use H. And when we use our table here for chute adjustment, we just talked about, again, we're looking at how far it is to clear the chute. So that's the distance from the tee to the end of the chute. So if it was 100 yards, we would look at, well, I guess I need to figure out what the width is, but we also need to determine what the width is. So if we go from our drip line to drip line, we're measuring that width, and it says it's 15 yards. So we have 15 yards, and then our distance is 100. It would fall into this category here. So you need both, and then that would get you a value of +1. So your H would be +1 there. And your H can get up to +4 depending on the length and how narrow it is. All right, and then the last adjustment here in trees is the O adjustment. And again, that's if trees obstruct the shot to the target, a landing zone, or a green. But again, do not apply if the trees are used in the shoot adjustment. Okay, so that could be, you could have trees that are not necessarily a shoot, but a second shot or a shot to the green where the trees in your landing zone might obstruct your shot to where you're going. You might have a scenario where, that tree is obstructing the shot to the green. So you might have, both an O plus for trees and for green target. So if you have a valley or a tree that sits literally right in front of the green, that would be a great situation where you're going to have both an O adjustment for trees and for green target. All right, I know we're a little bit over, so we'll end it there. But if anyone has any questions about trees, feel free to let me know. Next week we will cover the green surface, and then we'll get into transition zone, which is a complicated concept, but we will get it. And then the quiz is available for this week. So Hunter's put the quiz together, and I got one wrong. So hopefully some of you guys can beat me this week. But be careful on some of those adjustments when you're taking the quiz. So again, appreciate everyone joining us. I will stay on here for the next 5 minutes or so to answer any questions that come in. Yeah, Ernie, good question. So we are working on the schedule right now. We're making some good progress. I think we have 10 or more rates scheduled. So we're going to be getting those up here. Hunter, do you have probably next week? Probably we'll have some up on the website. Is that right?
Yeah, my plan is to start posting them on the website at some point next week. I'll probably be posting them in batches every week, starting next week.
We're just hoping that we get more good weather days like we're going to get this weekend, and no more snow. Although I think there's some snow coming next week too. So.
Question.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the shoot drawing that you had there?
Yeah.
Okay. If my shot is coming in for the bogey player, let's say, and that's my landing area, where my shoot is,
Yep.
I'm going to have also a decrease of my fairway width, because the odds are the ball is not going to be used. The fairway is going to be smaller there, and I would have to do a less width measurement. Would that be correct? If my landing zone is roughly in that shoot area?
Yeah. Yep. Definitely. Yeah. You would, if your landing zone was, let's say it was a par 4 and your landing zone was in and around here, you would definitely have that W adjustment. It just, again, you I think the important thing on that is what John all said, is that just make sure you know where your ball hits the ground. Because if your ball hits the ground back here before the trees start, then it's not really decreasing the width of your fairway. If your ball is hitting on the ground, near where these trees are, then you could have a W plus adjustment there. But it really just depends on where your landing zone, and when the ball is traveling there, if the trees are going to decrease the width of the fairway, effective width of the fairway. Does that make
Okay,
sense?
so I'd still have my W adjustment, but if the fairway normally is 32, let's say 30, but now those trees have made it a 24 or 20, 24, whatever that number might have been.
Yeah.
I still would get a W plus my width is also narrower.
So, and when you're measuring it, you're still going to use the value of 30 from one edge to the other, and then you just put a W plus to that 30. You wouldn't necessarily calculate how much is cut off. You would just use the normal fairway measurement and then put a W plus there.
Bob, John Hollow? Bob?
Yes.
Yeah, Kyle said exactly what I would instruct my raters to do. I'd make it a W plus. There wouldn't be any obstruction. I don't want to double dip on a lot of different things.
Okay, when we did a course down here in Florida, and the captain sat there and made a decision right there and said, well, since those trees are going to block both sides of the fairway, he narrowed the fairway width. He gave it a W, but he also went and narrowed the width of the fairway. And I kind of like, I didn't know how to respond to him, because I thought I was going to do the fairway width with a W.
I'm glad
And
there's
he
only,
just,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I'm glad there's only 13 people there. Okay, so you double dip. Let's say I did the mistake. I did it that way. What's 1 point in the scheme of things? But I try not to double dip. So my instruction to the crew would be use the W plus, but don't use an O.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, what you were thinking, Bob, was right, is that you wouldn't decrease the fairway value for that. The fairway value is the fairway value. But those adjustments would be put in place.
Okay.
So it would still be 30 or whatever, and then a W plus.
Perfect. Okay.
Pre-filled info we get. So a couple questions here, Tim, about the Form 1. So the sample on the web shows the pre-filled info. Yep. So you'll get one that will look very similar to this. We'll have all the information put in, and then the information that you put in will be some of the adjustments as well as some of the other measurements that so when we did that lateral example, when we go to our first landing zone and we have water to the left, we're going to shoot how far it is from the middle fairway, write that down. And we'll fill some of that information, but everything that you see on the page here will be pre-filled, and you won't have to fill that out. Rating assignments are by gender. We assign only male rating, of course, we're rating both. Yeah, so when you get signed a sheet, your sheet will have what gender it is and what tee you're doing, and you'll do the bogey and scratch player from that tee for that gender. So in this case here, we got the purple tee and we're the men's, but we're looking at both the bogey and the scratch player from that purple tee. And I might have the women's green tee, and I'll do it from the women's perspective from the green tees. So every person will be assigned one specific tee when they're getting a form. And obviously, as a new rater, we're not going to throw you in the deep end right away. You'll be able to go out with other folks that have done this before and kind of shadow them out there. So.